Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. This is a lecture on Nietzsche's critique of liberalism. So last week I did a lecture on an introduction to Nietzsche's general philosophy and works, and I had a comment from one of the viewers requesting an introduction to Nietzsche's critique of liberalism or Nietzsche on liberalism, and I thought that would be a good point of departure. I thought that was a good idea, a good point of departure, a good entryway into Nietzsche's political philosophy generally. So let's get started. So first, we need to define what is liberalism. And I always like to go back to the roots of these words. So this is from the Etymology or Etymology Online Dictionary. And basically in English, we start seeing the word liberal in the 14th century, and generally meaning generous. So someone is liberal with their gifts, nobly born, noble, free, as opposed to, let's say, attached to labor, that type of thing. And this comes from French, Old French, and originally Latin, liberalis, which has its meaning in noble, gracious, generous, pertaining to a free person rather than a slave. So we have all these senses in the word liberal: noble, free, also generous and giving. So liberalism within political philosophy is a complex topic. There's different aspects of it. There's different definitions. We'll have to stay very general. And one distinction I would highlight, though, is that we need to think of liberty, modern notions of liberty, as distinct from ancient notions of liberty. So a good place to start on thinking in those terms is the essay by Benjamin Constant, The Liberty of the Ancients Compared with That of the Moderns. So it's a kind of the first person to articulate that there's profound distinction between how the ancients thought of being free as being a free for the fulfillment of their noble duties, as opposed to modern liberty being just freedom from constraint, allowing me to do whatever I want to do. So generally, if we want to take kind of a rough definition of what liberalism means within the modern age, it generally means freedom relating to a free person. It means individualism and a recognition that there's a variety of individuals who should have the right to pursue their own notion of what is the good life, so their own ends. That means a suspicion of state or government power as something that could, let's say, try to dictate what those ends are. The determination of what the ends of one's own individual life should be left to the individual. Thus, we don't want state or government to, let's say, try to inculcate cultural views of morality. So a corollary of this, as I have in the sub-bullet there, is that public education, rather than a moral education to a common end, which would be the way in which education was understood with the ancients, today education is less about moral education to a common end than an accreditation, enabling individuals to have the means through participation in the labor market, what have you, to achieve their own ends. And then finally, liberalism involves tolerance to other views because of this recognition that there are a plurality of individuals with a plurality of ends. So on the political side of liberalism, one of the foundations of liberalism is in Locke, and we don't need to go through this thoroughly. However, just a recognition that for Locke, the state of nature is one in which individuals enjoyed a state of perfect freedom, a perfect equality and plenty, and that there are several rights of these individuals by the law of nature, and the most fundamental right being the right to self-preservation. So we get into social contracts with society, according to Locke and others, in order to preserve that most fundamental right of self-preservation, to better secure that. And the way to do that is that the state is there to secure the individual rights of life, liberty, property as a means to that self-preservation. So in the current climate, I will say there are a number of critiques of liberalism. On the left, the critique finds its way in terms of a critique of notions of individual freedom and merit being notions that mask systemic barriers to various identity groups. So that's sometimes called woke liberalism or a woke critique of liberalism, depending on how you view it. On the left, there's also an increasing tendency to see economic liberalism as having led to extreme wealth inequalities. On the right, the critique of liberalism is one which tries to show how liberalism's tolerance inevitably leads to moral relativism and the woke liberalism of identity politics. So there's a couple of references there. Patrick Deneen is a good place to start, and a good overview of all these debates is in this Fukuyama text on the right that I've shown. So Nietzsche and liberalism. So if we take that rough definition of liberalism, we could see Nietzsche at first glance as a defender of the principles of liberalism. He certainly seems to defend the notions of the free individual versus what he would call the herd instinct or the many. Wants to celebrate the freedom of the individual, the free spirit, who is able to go above and beyond, not be determined by the herd or by the society within which he lives. There's also a profound suspicion of the state we see in Nietzsche, probably most famously in Thus Spoke Zarathustra in the section in part one entitled On the New Idol. He calls the state the coldest of all cold monsters. So as a result, Nietzsche sometimes, as a result of this, let's say, seeming adherence to liberal principles, Nietzsche can sometimes be marshaled or invoked in the name of progressive causes. So the postmodernists, Deleuze, Foucault, Derrida, were definitely acolytes of Nietzsche and pointed to Nietzsche as a philosopher who could be seen as liberating these types of individual forces against tyrannical systems or fascistic systems that would try to control those individuals or those drives. I think, however, if we look more closely at Nietzsche's philosophy, we see that his celebration, first of all, celebration of the free spirit or of individualism is for a few. It's what we could call an aristocratic individualism. It's not the modern liberal democratic liberalism that we normally associate with liberalism. Also, his critique of the state is less about the state's power over the individual than a critique of the modern commercial state that reduces the goals of individuals to a mediocrity. So this to continue, if we read more closely, that section on the new idol says, and this lie crawls out of its mouth. I, the state, am the people. That is a lie. It was creators who created peoples and hung a faith and a love over them. Thus they served life. So genuine peoples, according to this, create a table of values, goals, things for a people to strive toward. And we can think of the Romans as a genuine people, the Roman privileging of honor and loyalty that allowed them to conquer the world. So later in the book, a few sections later, Zarathustra enumerates different systems of values, Hebrew valuing or honoring of father and mother, and we have the creator there being Moses, and he also indicates ostensibly the Roman value system when he says to practice loyalty and for the sake of loyalty to risk honor and blood even for evil and dangerous things. So this is the section entitled On the 1001 Goals. So whereas creators, Moses for the Hebrew people, or the Romans with their value system, whereas they serve life in forging goals for a people. Annihilators who forge states serve death, according to Zarathustra in On the New Idol. So rather than those common goals or ends, the modern state only values the pursuit of consumer desires, what he calls 100 appetites in that section. It is annihilators who set traps for the many and call them state. They hang a sword and 100 appetites over them. So all they can have as a common goal is the fact that we want to acquire goods. The common goals of being noble, or honoring father and mother, the old goals of peoples, those are the preserve of individuals. Individuals choose their ends according to modern liberalism. So the only common goal is the means to the end, the means being the acquisition of wealth and consumer goods. So this gets us to, let's say an overview, a 10,000-foot view of what Nietzsche's overall political philosophy is. And I think we see this in his early thinking. I have a couple of essays on Nietzsche's early political philosophy, and we see this even in his later philosophy. So generally speaking, if we were to, as I said, to take a very rough sketch, we could say that beings as a whole, that the point of departure is a metaphysical one, an assertion of what is the nature of beings as a whole or being. And for Nietzsche, that is variously in the early works, nature as strife, and the later works, will to power. And then that manifests itself in political institutions. Nature wants these political institutions, these cultural institutions, to overcome itself. And the goal of these political institutions, and I'll point out they are hierarchical institutions, we'll come back to that. The goal of these institutions is the creation of a few highest individuals, artistic geniuses, philosophical geniuses, military geniuses. So that has implications for freedom. Rather than the freedom of modern liberalism, which is a freedom from constraint, Nietzsche's freedom will be different. So here, a quote from Twilight of the Idols, where he's critiquing modern notions of freedom. He says, today the individual still has to be made possible by being pruned. Possible here means whole. The reverse is what happens. The claim for independence, for free development, for laisser-aller, is pressed most hotly by the very people for whom no reins would be too strict. This is true in politics, this is true in art. But that is a symptom of decadence. Our modern conception of freedom is one more proof of the degeneration of the instincts. So true freedom for Nietzsche is a freedom for an achievement of one's end. And again, it's the organic metaphor of a plant. So a plant, one of my favorite examples in my own experience has been years ago. I tried to grow these tomato plants, and at first, not knowing how to do these things, I didn't have a stake, so I just let these plants grow free from constraints, so to speak, and they just languished and died. They just, they spread around the ground there. They weren't able to grow and produce their fruit, their goal. So the true freedom of the tomato plant is to be staked and constrained, and as he said in the last quote, pruned to a certain extent. That enables it to grow towards its end. So this is freedom for, or freedom to achieve one's end. And here another quote from Twilight of the Idols. For what is freedom? That one has the will to assume responsibility for oneself, that one maintains the distance which separates us, that one becomes more indifferent to difficulties, hardships, privation, even to life itself, that one is prepared to sacrifice human beings for one's cause, not excluding oneself. Freedom means that the manly instincts which delight in war and victory dominate over other instincts, for example, over those of pleasure. So another, let's say, nuance to this is that within modern liberalism, the most fundamental goal is self-preservation. And our common goal then is the means to self-preservation. So for Nietzsche, the will to power is fundamental principle. It's the will to to overcome. It's not a mere will to exist. It's just a will to life. No, it's a it's a it's a will to achieve these goals and overcome. So, as I mentioned, the goal of society and political institutions then is not merely the preservation of the many and the mere preservation of life or property. It's the conscious production of the genius. A great quote from Beyond Good and Evil here. A nation is a detour of nature to arrive at 6 or 7 great men. Yes, and then to get around them. So even then, once you've achieved those 6 or 7 great men, they're going to create certain value systems. They're going to impose their view on the world, but that can become stultifying and can prevent the creation of new geniuses. So nature needs to get around them as well. Another quote here from Schopenhauer as Educator, an earlier essay of Nietzsche's on this notion of the need to create the conditions for the production of the genius. We ought really to have no difficulty in seeing that when a species has arrived at its limits and is about to go over into a higher species, the goal of its evolution lies not in the mass of its exemplars and their well-being, but rather in those apparently scattered and chance existences which favorable conditions have here and there produced. And it ought to be just as easy to understand the demand that, because it can arrive at a conscious awareness of its goal, mankind ought to seek out and create the favorable conditions under which those great redemptive men can come into existence. So we see here almost an early evocation of the notion of the overman, that humanity is at the cusp of an evolution, and rather than just preserving the mass of humanity, what will further that evolution are the rare types. Now, nature normally just does this randomly. And again, this is very Darwinian. However, since mankind is that conscious species which can come to recognize the goal of nature, for Nietzsche, the humanity should create societies, political institutions that have as their goal the conscious production of the genius, rather than their kind of random production as it is now. So I mentioned that another principle, again, a principle contrary to modern notions of liberalism, a principle of these political institutions is that they are hierarchical. And rather than equality of rights to all individuals, he praises the laws of Manu, which are these legal and moral texts in the Hindu tradition from the 1st to 3rd centuries of the Common Era. And in these laws, the highest privileges are accorded only to the few. So it's a hierarchical, stratified caste system with kind of laborers, warriors, administrators, and then the highest spiritual types. In the highest caste, I call them the fewest. Being perfect also has the privileges of the fewest, among them to represent happiness, beauty, and graciousness on earth. The order of castes, the order of rank, merely formulates the highest law of life. The separation of the 3 types is necessary for the preservation of society to make possible the higher and the highest types. The inequality of rights is the first condition for the existence of any rights at all. And then he continues, a high culture is a pyramid. It can stand only on a broad base. Its first presupposition is a strong and soundly consolidated mediocrity. Whom do I hate most among the rabble of today? The socialist rabble, who undermine the instinct, the pleasure, the worker's sense of satisfaction with his small existence, who make him envious, who teach him revenge. The source of wrong is never unequal rights, but the claim of equal rights. And then finally, I want to end on this note that Nietzsche's critique of liberalism is a critique of political liberalism, first of all. So there's a political critique there, but even more profoundly, Nietzsche critiques the metaphysical foundations of liberalism. And what I would call those medical physical foundations would be the notion of an individual subject as this atomic entity that beholds the world objectively, assesses, makes choices. So this is the Cartesian subject of modern metaphysics, most profoundly articulated by Heidegger later, and that's a different discussion. But Nietzsche already has some, let's say, deconstruction of this modern subject. And for him, this, as I said, this subject is a product of the flawed metaphysics of Descartes. So a quote from his notebook, The Will to Power: "There is thinking, therefore there is something that thinks." This is the upshot of all Descartes' argumentation. But that means positing as true a priori our belief in the concept of substance, that when there is thought, there has to be some thing that thinks, is simply a formulation of our grammatical custom that adds a doer to every deed. So Nietzsche's basically saying that this leap of logic of Descartes that assumes that there has to be this subject of the thinker behind the activity of thinking. So there's cogito, I think, therefore there's an I behind that who exists. That leap of logic is merely a grammatical function. It's a grammatical function of the fact that we have subjects and predicates in our linguistic system. He has other ways he deconstructs the Cartesian subject as well, in terms of the I, the subject being merely a product of social conditioning, and the assumption of guilt through centuries and centuries of formation, and he describes that in the first essay of on the genealogy of morals. So as I said, a political critique of liberalism, but also a profound critique of the metaphysical foundation, the notion of an atomic individual subject. As I said, in Nietzsche's political philosophy, there's this individual can be one manifestation of the will to power, and the political institutions are there to craft individuals, but it's not an atomic individual. It is a manifestation of the will to power, and that's the fundamental metaphysical foundation. So with that, I'll close in terms of Nietzsche's critique of liberalism. I hope it was useful. Let me know in the comments if you have any additions to this, any other aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy, whether it's general philosophy or political philosophy you'd like to explore. Thank you very much.